The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the general store, and Eleanor Foster peered through the dusty window at the sparse wooden buildings of Oatman, Arizona Territory, wondering if she had made the worst mistake of her life. It was August 1882, and the desert heat pressed down on everything like a heavy blanket. Eleanor smoothed her faded calico dress, the blue flowers barely visible after years of washing, and took a deep breath. This was the only decent dress she owned, and she had worn it to meet her future husband for the first time. Her stomach twisted with anxiety as the driver opened the door and offered his weathered hand to help her down. "Here you are, Miss Oatman." "Small mining town, but folks are decent enough," the driver said, his voice gruff but kind. Eleanor stepped onto the dusty street, her worn boots settling into the fine Arizona sand. She carried a single carpet bag containing everything she owned in the world. The letter had been clear. Frank Barrett needed a wife. He ran a cattle ranch outside town and had no time to court properly. She needed a home and security after her parents died of scarlet fever in Missouri, leaving her with nothing but debts. The arrangement seemed practical, if not romantic. She stood there in the blazing afternoon sun, scanning the handful of people on the street. A group of miners headed into the saloon across the way. Two women in fine silk dresses with parasols walked past, their noses slightly elevated as they noticed her shabby appearance. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn, but she lifted her chin. Poverty was nothing to be ashamed of. "Miss Foster." A deep voice came from behind her. Eleanor turned and found herself looking up at a tall man with sun-bronzed skin and warm brown eyes. He wore dusty work clothes, a wide-brimmed hat, and had a red bandana tied around his neck. His dark hair curled slightly at his collar, and despite the dust and the simple clothing, he had a presence that made her breath catch. "Yes. Are you Mr. Barrett?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Frank Barrett. Pleased to finally meet you, Miss Foster." He removed his hat, revealing more of his face. He looked to be in his mid-20s, maybe 26 or 27, with strong features and a mouth that seemed accustomed to smiling, though at the moment he appeared as nervous as she felt. They stood there awkwardly for a moment, both studying each other, weighing what they had gotten themselves into with this arrangement. "You must be tired after your journey," Frank finally said. "Would you like to get something to eat before we head out to the ranch? It is about an hour's ride." Eleanor nodded. "That would be nice, thank you." He picked up her carpet bag as though it weighed nothing and gestured toward a small restaurant at the end of the street. As they walked, Eleanor noticed how people greeted Frank warmly. He clearly had standing in this community. That eased some of her worry. At least he was not some disreputable character. The restaurant was simple but clean, with checkered cloths on the tables. Frank pulled out a chair for her, and she sat, grateful to be out of the direct sun. When the proprietor came over, a round woman with kind eyes, she beamed at Frank. "Frank Barrett, is this the young lady you have been expecting?" the woman asked with barely contained excitement. "Yes, madam. This is Miss Eleanor Foster from Missouri. Eleanor, this is Mrs. Henderson. She makes the best apple pie in the territory." "Oh, go on with you," Mrs. Henderson said, clearly pleased. "What can I get you too?" They ordered roast beef and potatoes, and once Mrs. Henderson bustled away, an uncomfortable silence settled between them. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap, studying the worn calico of her dress and wishing again that she had something finer to wear for this first meeting. "Your journey was all right?" Frank asked, clearly searching for conversation. "Long," Eleanor admitted. "But uneventful, which I suppose is the best one can hope for." Frank nodded. "I appreciate you coming all this way on just a few letters. I know it is a lot to ask." Eleanor met his eyes. You were honest about your circumstances. That is more than many would be. I want to be honest now too, Frank said, leaning forward slightly. My ranch is not fancy. I have been building it up for 3 years now, and it is starting to turn a profit, but it is hard work. I have cattle, some horses, and a house that is sturdy but plain. I know this is not what most women dream of. Most women dream of security and a good man, Eleanor said quietly. I am not expecting luxury, Mr. Barrett. I am expecting honesty and respect. Something shifted in his expression, a softness that had not been there before. You will have both, I promise you that. Mrs. Henderson returned with their food, and the conversation became easier as they ate. Frank told her about his ranch, the Lost Creek Ranch, named for the creek that ran through the property but often dried up in summer. He had 2 horses, 40 head of cattle, and hoped to expand. He had a hired hand, an older man named Pete who lived in the bunkhouse and helped with the heavy work. Eleanor told him about Missouri, about growing up on a small farm, about losing her parents and finding herself alone with no means of support. She did not tell him about the creditors who had taken everything, about the shame of having nowhere to go, about the desperate feeling that had driven her to answer his advertisement. Some things were too raw to share just yet. After they finished eating, Frank helped her into his wagon. It was a practical vehicle, nothing fancy, with a flat bed in back and a simple bench seat up front. He loaded her carpet bag and climbed up beside her, taking the reins of the 2 sturdy horses hitched to it. As they left town, heading into the desert landscape dotted with mesquite and sagebrush, Eleanor tried to picture her new life. The mountains rose in the distance, purple and imposing. The sun beat down relentlessly, and she was grateful for her bonnet, even if it was as faded as her dress. Is it always this hot? She asked. Summers are brutal, Frank admitted, but the winters are mild. You will appreciate that come December. They passed other ranches, some prosperous-looking with painted fences and large houses, others barely more than shacks. Eleanor wondered where Frank's place fell on that spectrum. She told herself it did not matter. She had lived simply all her life. She could make a home anywhere. When they turned off the main road onto a narrower track, Frank glanced at her. Almost there. Eleanor's heart began to pound. This was it. Her new life was about to begin. The ranch house came into view, and Eleanor felt a wash of relief. It was not grand, but it was solid. A single-story structure made of adobe and wood, with a covered porch across the front. Behind it stood a barn and a smaller building that must be the bunkhouse. A corral held several horses, and in the distance, she could see cattle grazing. Frank pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. Welcome to Lost Creek Ranch. Before he could help her down, an older man emerged from the barn. He had gray hair, a weathered face, and walked with a slight limp. That is Pete, Frank said. Pete, come meet Miss Foster. Pete approached, removing his hat. Pleased to meet you, miss. Frank has been talking about your arrival for weeks. Pleased to meet you as well, Eleanor said, feeling a bit overwhelmed. Frank carried her bag up onto the porch and opened the door. Let me show you the house. Inside, it was simple but clean. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table and chairs, and a rocking chair by the window. 2 doors led off the main room. That is my room, Frank said, gesturing to one door. And this one here, this will be your room for now. Eleanor understood what he was not saying. They would not share a room until after they were married. It was proper and considerate, and she felt some of her tension ease. He opened the door to show her a small bedroom with a simple bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. It was sparse but adequate. I know it is not much, Frank began. It is fine, Eleanor interrupted. Truly, it is more than adequate. She set her carpetbag on the bed and turned to find Frank watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "I thought we could get married in town on Saturday," he said. "That gives you a few days to settle in, make sure this is what you want. The minister comes through Oatman once a week, and he will be there Saturday morning." "That sounds reasonable," Eleanor agreed, though her stomach fluttered at the thought. "And Eleanor," Frank said, his voice serious, "if you change your mind, if you decide this is not what you want, I will buy you a ticket to wherever you want to go. No hard feelings. I would rather you leave than be miserable." His kindness nearly undid her. She had expected a business arrangement, cold and practical. Instead, she found herself facing a man who seemed genuinely concerned for her welfare. "Thank you," she managed. "That is very generous." He nodded and stepped back. "I will let you rest and unpack. Supper will be in about 2 hours. Nothing fancy, just beans and cornbread. I'm afraid my cooking is pretty basic." After he left, closing the door quietly behind him, Eleanor sat on the bed and looked around her new room. Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them back. She had made it. She was safe. She had a roof over her head and the promise of security. It was more than she had dared hope for just a few weeks ago. She unpacked her meager belongings. 2 other dresses, equally worn, some undergarments, a hairbrush, and a small Bible that had been her mother's. That was the sum total of what she had brought to this new life. As she changed out of her traveling dress and washed her face in the basin on the dresser, she thought about Frank. He was younger than she had expected, and far more handsome. His letters had been straightforward and practical, giving her no sense of his character beyond his honesty about needing a wife. In person, he seemed kind and thoughtful. She could do far worse. Eleanor was 22 years old, and she had never been in love. She had been courted by a boy back in Missouri before her parents died, but it had been nothing serious. She wondered if love would come with time, or if she and Frank would simply build a companionable partnership. Either way, she was determined to make the best of this new beginning. When she emerged from her room 2 hours later, she found Frank at the stove, stirring a pot of beans. He had washed up and changed his shirt, and his damp hair suggested he had dunked his head in water to cool off. "Can I help?" Eleanor asked. "If you want to set the table, that would be good," Frank said. "Plates are in that cupboard there." They moved around the kitchen in careful politeness, each giving the other plenty of space. Eleanor found plates, cups, and utensils and laid them out on the table. Frank brought over the pot of beans and a pan of cornbread that was only slightly burned on the bottom. "Pete eats in the bunkhouse," Frank explained as they sat down. "He likes his privacy." They bowed their heads, and Frank said a simple grace. Then they began to eat. "This is good," Eleanor said, and it was. The beans were well seasoned, and even the slightly burned cornbread tasted wonderful after the long journey. "You do not have to be polite," Frank said with a small smile. "I know it is plain food." "Plain food is still good food," Eleanor said. "I was raised on simple meals. My mother always said it was the company that mattered, not what was on the table." Frank's smile widened. "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was," Eleanor said softly. "I miss her every day." They talked more easily over the meal, sharing stories about their childhoods. Frank had grown up in Texas, the youngest of 5 children. His father had been a ranch hand, and Frank had learned the trade from the ground up. When his father died, Frank had decided to strike out on his own, coming to Arizona territory to start his own place. It had been hard and lonely work, but he was proud of what he had built. After supper, Eleanor insisted on washing the dishes. Frank dried them, and they worked side by side in companionable silence. When the kitchen was clean, Frank excused himself to check on the horses, and Eleanor found herself alone in the quiet house. She walked out onto the porch and sat in the wooden chair there, watching the sun set over the mountains. The sky turned brilliant shades of orange and pink, and despite the strangeness of everything, Eleanor felt a sense of peace settle over her. Maybe this would work out. Maybe she had found a place where she could belong. Frank returned as the last light faded from the sky. He sat in the chair next to hers, and they watched the stars begin to appear. "It is beautiful here," Eleanor said. "It is," Frank agreed. "That never gets old, watching the sunset and the stars come out." They sat in silence for a while, the darkness wrapping around them like a blanket. Night sounds began. The chirp of crickets, the distant howl of a coyote, the soft lowing of cattle. "I should probably turn in," Eleanor finally said. "It has been a long day." "Of course," Frank said, standing. "If you need anything, just knock. I am a light sleeper." Eleanor went to her room and prepared for bed. She lay in the unfamiliar darkness, listening to the sounds of this new place, and tried not to think too hard about Saturday, when she would marry a man she barely knew. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her, and she drifted into sleep. The next few days fell into a rhythm. Eleanor woke early, helped prepare breakfast, and then Frank would head out to work with Pete. Eleanor spent her days cleaning the house, which was not dirty but clearly lacked a woman's touch. She found some fabric scraps and made curtains for the kitchen window. She organized the cupboards and swept every corner. In the evenings, she and Frank would sit on the porch and talk. She learned that he loved horses more than cattle, that he dreamed of expanding his herd and maybe breeding horses someday. He learned that she could sew and bake, that she had helped her father with the farm work and was not afraid of hard labor, that she loved reading but owned no books because they had all been sold to pay debts. Each conversation brought them a little closer. Eleanor began to relax around him, and she noticed that Frank seemed more at ease too. He started to smile more, to joke gently. She discovered that he had a good sense of humor and a kind heart. On Friday evening, the day before the wedding, Frank came back to the house earlier than usual. Eleanor was making stew for supper, having found some vegetables in the small garden behind the house. "That smells amazing," Frank said, washing his hands at the basin. "I found carrots and onions in the garden," Eleanor said. "I hope you do not mind that I use them." "Mind. I planted that garden and then barely touched it. I am glad someone is putting it to use." He dried his hands and turned to face her. "Eleanor, I wanted to talk to you before tomorrow." Her heart skipped. "All right. I just want to make sure you are certain about this. Marriage is a big step, and I know we have only known each other a few days. If you have doubts, we can wait. Or if you have changed your mind entirely, that is all right too." Eleanor set down the wooden spoon she had been using to stir the stew. "Do you have doubts?" "No," Frank said firmly. "I think you are brave and strong, and I am grateful you came all this way. I just want to make sure you are doing this because you want to, not because you feel you have no choice." Eleanor considered his words carefully. "I will not lie and say I had many options. But I could have answered other advertisements, and I chose yours. I chose to come here. These past few days, I have seen that you are a good man, Frank Barrett. I think we can make a good life together." Frank's expression softened. "I think so too." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. "I wanted to give you this." He opened his hand to reveal a simple gold band. It was not fancy, but it gleamed in the lamplight. "It was my grandmother's," Frank said. "My mother gave it to me before she died, said I should give it to my wife someday. I would be honored if you would wear it." Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes. "It is beautiful." "Try it on," Frank said. She held out her left hand and Frank slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered. Frank smiled, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Then Frank cleared his throat and stepped back. "I will let you finish cooking. I need to wash up properly." After he left, Eleanor looked down at the ring on her finger. Something warm bloomed in her chest, something that felt like the beginning of hope. That night, as she lay in bed, Eleanor realized she was no longer afraid of tomorrow. She was actually looking forward to it. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright. Eleanor wore her faded calico dress, the best she had, and brushed her dark blonde hair until it shone. She pinned it up as neatly as she could and studied herself in the small mirror on the dresser. She looked nervous but determined. When she emerged from her room, she found Frank dressed in his best clothes: dark trousers, a clean white shirt, and a black vest. He had shaved and combed his hair, and he looked so handsome that Eleanor's breath caught. "You look beautiful," Frank said, and the sincerity in his voice made her blush. "Thank you. You look very nice, too." They climbed into the wagon and headed toward town. Pete had offered to come along as a witness, and he sat in the back, wearing his own version of Sunday clothes. The ride to Oatman felt both too long and too short. Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap, and she jumped slightly when Frank reached over and placed one of his hands over hers. "It will be all right," he said quietly. She nodded, not trusting her voice. The minister was waiting at the small church at the edge of town. He was an elderly man with white hair and a gentle manner. Mrs. Henderson from the restaurant was there too, along with her husband, ready to serve as additional witnesses. "Shall we begin?" the minister asked. Eleanor and Frank stood before him, and the ceremony began. The words washed over Eleanor in a blur. She heard herself making vows, heard Frank's steady voice making his own promises. Then the minister was pronouncing them husband and wife, and Frank was gently lifting her chin and pressing a soft kiss to her lips. It was done. She was Eleanor Barrett now. Mrs. Henderson insisted they come to the restaurant for a celebratory meal. The restaurant had been closed to regular customers, and Mrs. Henderson had prepared a feast: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh bread, and apple pie. Other townspeople stopped by to offer congratulations. Eleanor was introduced to so many people that she knew she would never remember all the names. But everyone was kind and welcoming, and she began to feel like maybe she could find a place in this community. As they were finishing their pie, two women in elegant silk dresses entered the restaurant. Eleanor recognized them as the women who had looked down their noses at her the day she arrived. "Frank Barrett, married at last," one of them said, her voice carrying across the room. "We were all so curious about your mail-order bride." There was something cruel in the way she said it, and Eleanor felt her cheeks burn. Frank stood up, his face hardening. "Mrs. Clayton, may I introduce my wife, Eleanor Barrett." The woman's eyes raked over Eleanor's faded calico dress, taking in every worn patch and faded flower. Her lip curled slightly. "How nice," Mrs. Clayton said, her tone suggesting it was anything but. "That is quite a dress." Before Eleanor could respond, Frank stepped forward. His voice was firm and carried an edge she had never heard before. "This dress might be faded calico, but my wife outshines every silk gown I have seen. Real beauty comes from character, not fancy fabric. Now, if you will excuse us, we are celebrating with friends who actually know what matters in life." The restaurant had gone silent. Mrs. Clayton's face turned red, and she stammered something incomprehensible before turning on her heel and leaving, her companion hurrying after her. As soon as the door closed behind them, the restaurant erupted in applause and laughter. "Well said, Frank," Mr. Henderson called out. "She has had that coming for years," someone else added, but Eleanor barely heard any of it. She was staring at Frank, her heart pounding. He had defended her, stood up for her, made it clear that he valued her. The warmth that had begun in her chest days ago suddenly blazed into something stronger, something that felt dangerously close to love. Frank sat back down and reached for her hand under the table. "Are you all right?" "Thank you," Eleanor managed. "No one has ever done that for me before." "You are my wife now," Frank said simply. "No one speaks to you that way." The rest of the celebration passed in a happy blur. When they finally loaded back into the wagon to head home, Eleanor felt lighter than she had in years. Pete rode in back again, humming a tuneless song, giving them privacy. "I meant what I said," Frank told her as they drove through the desert. "That dress does not matter. You are beautiful just as you are." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes again. "Frank Barrett, you are going to make me cry." "Happy tears, I hope. Very happy tears." When they arrived back at the ranch, Pete excused himself to the bunkhouse, giving them a knowing grin. Eleanor and Frank walked into the house together, suddenly shy again. "I can sleep on the floor in the main room tonight if you prefer," Frank offered. "We do not have to rush anything." Eleanor looked at him, this man who had shown her nothing but kindness and respect, who had defended her honor, who had given her his grandmother's ring. She thought about the vows they had just made, about the life they were beginning together. "We are married," she said softly. "I do not want you sleeping on the floor." Frank's eyes widened slightly. "Are you sure?" "I am sure." That night, as Eleanor lay in Frank's arms in his room, which was now their room, she felt truly safe for the first time since her parents had died. Frank had been gentle and patient, and afterward he held her close and pressed kisses to her hair. "I am glad you came to Oatman," he whispered. "So am I," Eleanor whispered back. The next weeks fell into a new rhythm. Eleanor threw herself into being a ranch wife. She learned to make sourdough bread, tended the garden with new vigor, and even helped Pete mend some fencing. Frank taught her to ride properly, and they would sometimes ride out together in the evenings to check on the cattle. The physical work was hard, but Eleanor did not mind. She was building something, creating a life, and it felt good. More than that, she was falling in love with her husband. It happened gradually, in small moments. The way Frank always made sure she had enough to eat before he served himself. How he would bring her wildflowers he found while checking the fence lines. The sound of his laugh when she told a funny story. The way he held her each night as though she was precious. One evening in late September, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Eleanor realized she needed to tell him. "Frank," she said. He was whittling a piece of wood, making something he had not yet revealed. "I need to tell you something." He looked up, concerned. "What is it?" "When I came here, I was grateful for security and a home. That was all I expected." Frank's expression became guarded. "And now I have so much more than that." She turned to face him fully. "I have fallen in love with you." Frank dropped the wood he was holding. "Eleanor, you do not have to say it back," she said quickly. "I just needed you to know." "Are you going to let me talk?" Frank asked, but he was smiling. Eleanor closed her mouth. "I have been in love with you since the day you arrived in that faded calico dress, looking scared but determined," Frank said. "I did not know if you would ever feel the same, if this would always just be practical for you. Hearing you say those words, it is the best thing that has ever happened to me." Eleanor felt joy bubble up inside her. "Really, really." Frank set aside his whittling and pulled her into his arms. "I love you, Eleanor Barrett, more than I thought it was possible to love someone." They kissed as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and Eleanor thought about how far she had come. She had arrived in Oatman with nothing but a worn carpet bag and a faded dress, expecting only survival. Instead, she had found a home and a love deeper than she had ever imagined possible. As autumn turned to winter, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. The realization came in November when her monthly courses did not arrive, and she found herself feeling queasy in the mornings. She waited a few more weeks to be certain, then told Frank one evening over supper. He was on his feet in an instant, coming around the table to pull her into his arms. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor. I thought I would go to town next week and confirm it." Frank was grinning so wide his face looked like it might split. "We are going to have a baby." "We are going to have a baby," Eleanor confirmed, laughing at his excitement. The doctor in Oatman confirmed what Eleanor already knew. She was about 2 months along, which meant the baby would arrive sometime in late May or early June. Frank immediately went into protective mode, insisting she should not lift anything heavy and should rest more. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," Eleanor reminded him. "I am not made of glass." "I know, but you are precious cargo," Frank said. Humor me, she did, because she loved him and because secretly she appreciated his concern. Winter in Arizona was mild compared to Missouri winters, but there were still cold nights and occasional rain. Eleanor spent the time sewing baby clothes from fabric Frank bought in town, preparing for their new arrival. They converted her old room into a nursery, and Pete helped Frank build a cradle from smooth pine wood. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Eleanor felt good, aside from the morning sickness that faded after the first 3 months. Her body changed, her belly swelling with their growing child, and Frank treated her like she was the most beautiful woman in the world. On a warm evening in early spring, they sat on the porch as they did most nights. Eleanor was knitting a tiny sweater, and Frank was reading aloud from a book he had bought her, a collection of poems she had mentioned loving as a child. "Frank," Eleanor said suddenly. "Yes." "I was thinking about names." Frank set down the book. "I have been thinking about that too." They talked through various options. If it was a boy, Frank liked the name James after his father. If it was a girl, Eleanor loved the name Sarah after her mother. They decided that whatever the baby's name, the child would know they were wanted and loved. "I never thought I would have this," Frank said, placing his hand on Eleanor's rounded belly. "A wife I love, a child on the way, a ranch that is finally starting to thrive. 5 years ago I had nothing but determination and a dream." "Now you have a family," Eleanor said, covering his hand with hers. "Now I have everything," Frank corrected. As May arrived and Eleanor's time drew near, Frank became increasingly anxious. He wanted to be prepared for anything, so he brought Mrs. Henderson out from town to stay in Pete's bunkhouse. Pete had good-naturedly moved to a makeshift sleeping area in the barn, insisting he did not mind. Mrs. Henderson took over the kitchen, making nutritious meals for Eleanor and keeping the house in order so Eleanor could rest. She and Eleanor had become friends over the months, and Eleanor was grateful for the older woman's calm presence. The baby decided to arrive on a bright June morning. Eleanor woke just after dawn with a tightening across her belly that she knew meant labor had begun. She woke Frank, who immediately panicked, which made Eleanor laugh despite the discomfort. "Go get Mrs. Henderson," Eleanor said. "And then you and Pete should find something to do. This will take a while." Frank looked torn between wanting to stay and knowing he would be useless. Mrs. Henderson arrived, took one look at Eleanor and shooed the men out. "We will call you when there is news," she said firmly, closing the bedroom door in Frank's worried face. The labor was long and hard, as first births often are. Eleanor clung to Mrs. Henderson's hand through the contractions, breathing through the pain, drawing on reserves of strength she had not known she possessed. The afternoon sun was slanting through the window when the baby finally arrived, making their entrance into the world with a loud, indignant cry. "It is a boy," Mrs. Henderson announced, wrapping the squalling infant in a clean blanket. a healthy boy with a good set of lungs. Eleanor reached for her son with shaking arms. He was red-faced and perfect, with dark hair and tiny fists that waved in the air. She counted his fingers and toes, marveling at the miracle of him. Mrs. Henderson opened the door to find Frank pacing a trench in the floor of the main room. "You have a son, Frank Barrett. Mother and baby are both doing well." Frank was through the door in seconds. He stopped at the bedside, staring down at Eleanor and the bundle in her arms with an expression of such wonder that Eleanor felt fresh tears spring to her eyes. "Meet your son," Eleanor said softly. Frank reached out a tentative finger and the baby's tiny hand wrapped around it. Frank made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "James," he said. "James Barrett." "James," Eleanor agreed. Frank carefully climbed onto the bed next to Eleanor, wrapping his arms around both of them. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for coming to Arizona, for taking a chance on me, for giving me this gift." "Thank you for seeing past a faded dress to the woman underneath," Eleanor whispered back. They stayed like that, the three of them, a new family, as the evening light filled the room with gold. The next months were exhausting and wonderful. James was a good baby, but he still needed feeding every few hours, changing constantly, and seemed to prefer being held to being put down. Eleanor was tired all the time, but she had never been happier. Frank was a devoted father. He would walk the floor with James at night when the baby was fussy, singing old cowboy songs in his deep voice. He made ridiculous faces to get James to smile, and the first time the baby gave him a gummy grin. Frank practically glowed with pride. Pete turned out to be surprisingly good with children. He carved wooden toys for James and would sit on the porch holding the baby while Eleanor caught up on chores. Mrs. Henderson visited regularly, bringing food and advice, becoming like a grandmother to James. The ranch continued to prosper. Frank was able to buy more cattle and even started breeding horses, something he had dreamed of for years. Money was no longer quite so tight. Frank surprised Eleanor one day by coming home with a package wrapped in brown paper. "What is this?" Eleanor asked, wiping flour from her hands. She had been baking bread while James napped. "Open it and see." Eleanor unwrapped the package and gasped. Inside was fabric, beautiful blue cotton printed with tiny white flowers. There was enough for at least 2 dresses. "Frank, this is too much," she protested. "It is not nearly enough," Frank said. "You have been wearing the same 3 dresses for over a year. You deserve something new." Eleanor ran her hand over the soft fabric, already envisioning what she would make. "Thank you, but you know I do not need fancy things to be happy." "I know," Frank said, pulling her into his arms. "That is one of the many reasons I love you, but I want to give you things anyway because you deserve them." Eleanor used the fabric to make 2 new dresses, and the first time she wore one, Frank looked at her with such admiration that she blushed. But she kept one of her old calico dresses, the one she had worn the day she arrived in Oatman. She folded it carefully and put it away in the bottom of her dresser, a reminder of where she had started and how far they had come. James grew from an infant to a toddler, taking his first steps on the day of his first birthday. Frank and Eleanor stood on either side of him, encouraging him as he wobbled between them, and when he fell into Eleanor's arms, they both cheered as though he had accomplished the greatest feat in the world. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The ranch work was constant, but Frank hired another hand, a young man named Tom who was eager to learn ranching. This gave Frank more time to spend with his family, which he treasured. On their second wedding anniversary, Frank arranged for Pete to watch James for the evening. He took Eleanor on a ride up into the hills above the ranch, to a spot where they could see for miles across the desert landscape. "I wanted to bring you here," Frank said, helping Eleanor down from her horse. This is where I came when I first arrived in Arizona, when I was trying to decide if I could make this work." They sat on a flat rock, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. The desert stretched out below them, golden and peaceful. "What did you decide?" Eleanor asked. "I decided that I would give it everything I had, and if it failed, at least I would know I tried." Frank took her hand. "I never imagined it would turn out this well. I thought success meant having a profitable ranch. I did not understand that real success meant having someone to share it with." Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder. "I was so scared when I got off that stagecoach. I thought I was just trying to survive. I did not know I was about to start really living." "Do you ever regret it?" Frank asked. "Coming here marrying me?" "Not for a single second," Eleanor said firmly. "This is the life I was meant to have. You are the man I was meant to love." Frank kissed her softly, then pulled back with a smile. "I have something for you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Inside was a necklace, a delicate gold chain with a small pendant shaped like a flower. "Frank, it is beautiful," Eleanor breathed. "It reminded me of the flowers on your dress," Frank said. "The one you wore the day we met." Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes as Frank fastened the necklace around her neck. "I love it. I love you. I love you too. More every single day." They sat together as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple, and Eleanor thought about everything they had built together. A home, a family, a love that grew stronger with each passing day. By the time James turned 2, Eleanor was pregnant again. This time she recognized the signs immediately and told Frank over breakfast one morning. "Another baby," Frank said, his eyes lighting up. "James is going to be a big brother." This pregnancy was easier than the first. Eleanor knew what to expect, and her body seemed to handle it better. She still worked around the ranch, though Frank and Pete tried to convince her to rest more. James was a lively 2-year-old who kept her busy, and she did not have time to sit around. The second baby arrived on a cold January morning, coming much faster than James had. Mrs. Henderson barely made it to the ranch before Eleanor delivered a tiny daughter with Eleanor's fair coloring and a loud, demanding cry. "Sarah," Eleanor said, looking down at her daughter. "Sarah Barrett." Frank held his daughter with gentle reverence, and James was allowed in to meet his baby sister. He regarded her with deep suspicion at first, not sure what to make of this tiny, noisy creature who was getting so much attention. "This is your sister," Frank explained. "You have to help us take care of her." James reached out one chubby finger to touch Sarah's hand, and when the baby's fingers wrapped around his, he giggled with delight. "Baby," he announced. "That is right, your baby sister," Eleanor confirmed. Watching Frank with both children, seeing James's wonder at his new sister, Eleanor felt her heart might burst from the fullness of it all. This was her family. This was her life, and it was more beautiful than anything she could have imagined. The years continued to pass, marked by the small and large moments that make up a life. James grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved helping his father with the horses. Sarah was more adventurous, always getting into things, keeping Eleanor on her toes. When Sarah was 3, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant again, and Frank joked that they were well on their way to having a full ranch crew. The third baby, another boy they named Matthew, arrived in the fall. He was an easy baby, content to watch his older siblings play, smiling at everyone who paid him attention. The house was loud and chaotic now, filled with children's laughter and the constant motion of a growing family. Frank expanded the house, adding 2 more bedrooms so the children would not be too cramped as they grew. The ranch was thriving now, well respected in the territory. Frank had built a reputation for fair dealing and quality horses. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable, and that was enough. One evening when James was 8, Sarah was 5, and Matthew was 2, Eleanor stood on the porch watching her children play in the yard. James was teaching Sarah to rope a fence post, and Matthew was toddling around collecting rocks. Frank came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "We did good," he said. "We did," Eleanor agreed. "Do you remember what I said to you on our wedding day, about you outshining silk gowns?" "I remember. I meant it then, but I did not fully understand it. Now I do. True beauty is what you have built here. The way you love our children, the way you have made this house a home, the way you still look at me like I am something special even when I come in covered in dirt and smelling like horses." Eleanor turned in his arms to face him. "You are something special. You saw me when I felt invisible. You valued me when I thought I had nothing to offer. You loved me before I even knew how to love myself." "We saved each other," Frank said. "We did," Eleanor agreed. They kissed while their children played in the golden evening light, and Eleanor thought about the frightened young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Oatman all those years ago. That woman had been looking for security and survival. She had found so much more. As the years continued, the Barrett Ranch became a cornerstone of the community. Eleanor became known for her kindness, always ready to help a neighbor in need. She organized a lending library in town, finally able to share her love of books with others. Frank served on the school board and helped build a new church. James grew into a fine young man who shared his father's love of horses. By the time he was 16, he was helping train horses to sell, and Frank trusted him to handle important tasks around the ranch. Sarah was spirited and smart, keeping her parents on their toes with her endless questions and adventures. Matthew was gentle and artistic, spending hours drawing the desert landscape and the animals on the ranch. Eleanor and Frank watched their children grow with pride and some bittersweet sadness at how quickly time passed. But they still had each other, and their love had only deepened with the years. They still sat on the porch most evenings, talking about their day, making plans, simply enjoying each other's presence. When James turned 18, he announced he wanted to start his own ranch. Frank and Eleanor had saved money for such a moment, and they helped him buy a small piece of land bordering their property. Watching their oldest son strike out on his own was hard, but they were proud of the man he had become. Sarah showed no signs of wanting to settle down, declaring at 15 that she wanted to see the world before she made any decisions about her future. Eleanor saw so much of her own younger self in her daughter, that determination and spirit, and she encouraged Sarah to dream big. Matthew, at 12, was still finding his way, but his artwork was remarkable. Eleanor filled the walls of their home with his drawings, and Frank never failed to brag about his artistic son to anyone who would listen through it all. Eleanor never forgot where she came from. She kept that faded calico dress tucked away, and sometimes, on quiet afternoons, she would take it out and hold it, remembering. It reminded her to be grateful, to never take for granted the beautiful life she had built. One day, a young woman arrived in Oatman, looking lost and frightened. She had come from back east after answering an advertisement, only to discover the man who had sent for her was a drunk and a liar. She had nowhere to go and no money to leave. Eleanor heard about her from Mrs. Henderson, who still ran the restaurant though she was getting on in years. Eleanor immediately went to town and found the young woman sitting outside the general store, looking defeated. "My name is Eleanor Barrett," she introduced herself. "I understand you are in a difficult situation." The young woman, whose name was Catherine, nodded miserably. "I do not know what to do. I have nothing." Eleanor sat down beside her. I was once in a similar situation. I came to Oatman as a mail-order bride wearing a faded calico dress and carrying everything I owned in one small bag. I was terrified, but I met a good man and I built a life here. Things can change quickly, for the better, if you have some help. She brought Catherine back to the ranch, where the young woman stayed in the guest room they had added years ago. Over the next weeks, Eleanor helped Catherine find work at the restaurant, and Frank made inquiries about a young ranch hand who had been making eyes at Catherine whenever he came to town. 6 months later, Eleanor attended Catherine's wedding, watching another young woman get her fresh start, and felt the circle of kindness complete itself. As Eleanor and Frank entered their 40s, they began to slow down a bit. The years of hard work had taken their toll, though both were still healthy and active. They hired more help for the ranch, and Frank began teaching James more about the business side of things, preparing him to eventually take over. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Frank took Eleanor back to the spot in the hills where they had gone on their 2nd anniversary. The children were old enough now to manage things for a day, and it was just the two of them, like old times. 20 years, Frank said as they sat on the same flat rock, watching the same spectacular view. It feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once. I know what you mean, Eleanor said. Sometimes I can still feel how scared I was getting off that stagecoach. And sometimes it feels like I have always been here, like this was always my life. Do you ever wonder how things would have turned out if you had answered a different advertisement? Gone somewhere else? No, Eleanor said without hesitation, because I cannot imagine a life without you. Without our children, without this. She gestured to the ranch spread out below them. Frank pulled her close. I wrote that advertisement 3 times before I sent it. I was so worried no one would answer or that I would say the wrong thing. I could not believe it when you wrote back. Even more, I could not believe it when you actually came. Best decision I ever made, Eleanor said. Best day of my life when you stepped off that stagecoach, Frank replied. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the play of light across the desert as the sun moved across the sky. The landscape had not changed much in 20 years, but they had changed enormously. They had grown together, built together, loved together. You know what I was thinking about the other day, Eleanor said. That woman, Mrs. Clayton, who was so cruel about my dress on our wedding day. What about her? I saw her in town last month. She looked old and bitter. Her husband lost his money in a bad investment years ago, and I heard they live in a small house now and struggle to make ends meet. She wore a faded dress that was once fine but has seen better days. Did she say anything to you? Frank asked. She tried to avoid me, but I went up to her and invited her to tea. I do not think she knew what to say. She ended up accepting, and we had a pleasant enough conversation. I think she was lonely. Frank smiled and shook his head. You are a better person than I am. I would have been tempted to hold a grudge. What would be the point? She was unkind once, but that was 20 years ago. People change. I changed. Why should I assume she could not? This is why I love you, Frank said. You see the best in people. You taught me that, Eleanor said. You saw something worthwhile in a scared young woman in a faded dress. You taught me that appearances do not matter, that what counts is what is inside. They rode back to the ranch as the sun set, and Eleanor thought about how grateful she was for every twist and turn that had brought her to this place, to this man, to this life. The children continued to grow and find their own paths. James married a sweet young woman from a neighboring ranch, and within a year, Eleanor and Frank were grandparents to a baby girl. Holding her granddaughter for the first time, Eleanor felt the wheel of life turning, felt the past and future connecting in her arms. Sarah, true to her word, left Arizona when she turned 18. She went to California, then wrote letters about working in a hospital and learning to be a nurse. Her letters were full of excitement about everything she was seeing and doing, and though Eleanor missed her daughter terribly, she was proud of Sarah's courage. Matthew stayed close to home, setting up a small studio where he created artwork that people came from all over the territory to buy. He had a quiet life, never marrying, seemingly content with his art and his family nearby. Pete, who had been with them from the very beginning, passed away peacefully in his sleep when he was 73. They buried him on the ranch, under a cottonwood tree he had always loved. Frank gave a eulogy, talking about how Pete had been more than an employee. He had been family, had helped raise their children, had been a constant, steady presence through all the changes and challenges. Mrs. Henderson followed a few years later, and Eleanor wept at her funeral, remembering all the kindness the older woman had shown her. It was Mrs. Henderson who had helped her deliver her first baby, who had brought her into the community, who had become a dear friend. Eleanor made sure there was a proper memorial, and she visited Mrs. Henderson's grave regularly with fresh flowers. As Eleanor entered her 50s, she began to reflect more on her life. She had lived in Arizona for over 30 years now, longer than she had lived anywhere else. This was home in a way Missouri had never been. This land, with its harsh beauty and endless sky, had become part of her. She and Frank were both graying now, their bodies showing the wear of years of hard work. But they were healthy and active, and their love had only grown stronger. They had weathered droughts and hard winters, sick livestock and financial worries, the normal trials of raising children and building a life. Through it all, they had each other. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard, James's daughter now joined by his son, Frank took Eleanor's hand. "You remember what you said to me years ago about falling in love?" he asked. "I remember," Eleanor said. "I think about that day often. How brave you were to say it first, not knowing if I felt the same, how you gave me that gift." "It was not that brave," Eleanor protested. "By then I was fairly certain you loved me too. Maybe, but still you said it first. You always were the brave one." "I do not know about that. You are the one who left everything you knew to start a ranch in the middle of nowhere. You are the one who sent for a wife you had never met. That took courage." "We both had courage," Frank said. "That is why we worked so well together." James came up onto the porch, his son on his shoulders. "Papa, Mama, are you two getting sentimental again?" "Always," Frank said with a grin. "When you get to be our age, you will understand." "I already understand," James said, looking at his children with obvious love. "You taught me well." After James took his children home, Eleanor and Frank remained on the porch, the desert cooling around them as night fell. "I want you to know something," Eleanor said. "When I look back at my life, I do not regret a single moment, not the hard times, not the losses, nothing. Because it all led me here to you, to this." "I feel the same," Frank said. "Every choice I made, every hardship I endured, it was all worth it because it brought me to the day you stepped off that stagecoach." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes from decades of knowing another person completely. The stars began to appear overhead, the same stars they had watched together for over 30 years. "You still have that old calico dress?" Frank asked suddenly. "I do. It is in the chest in our room, wrapped in tissue paper." "Why do you keep it?" Eleanor thought about the question. "Because it reminds me of who I was and how far I have come. Because it was what I was wearing when my real life began. Because you told me I outshined every silk gown, and no one had ever made me feel that beautiful before." "You did. You do," Frank said. "You always will." As the years advanced, Eleanor and Frank settled into the peaceful rhythm of grandparent life. They still ran the ranch, though James took on more and more responsibility. They spent their days working in the garden, riding out to check on livestock, and most importantly, spoiling their grandchildren. Sarah eventually returned to Arizona, bringing with her a doctor she had met in California. They married and set up a practice in Oatman, and Sarah became known for her skill and compassion as a nurse. She gave Eleanor and Frank 2 more grandchildren to dote on. Matthew's artwork gained recognition beyond the territory. He had a showing in San Francisco that was written about in newspapers, and suddenly, their quiet son was somewhat famous. He handled it with his usual modest grace, continuing to live simply and create his beautiful work. When Eleanor turned 60, the whole family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. All 3 children were there with their families, and the house overflowed with grandchildren ranging from teenagers to toddlers. The noise was overwhelming and wonderful. At one point, Eleanor stood in the kitchen, watching the chaos of her large, loving family, and felt tears of joy stream down her face. Frank found her there and wrapped her in his arms. "Happy tears?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "The happiest," Eleanor confirmed. "I just cannot believe this is my life. That scared girl who arrived here with nothing would never have believed she could have all this." "That scared girl was always strong and special," Frank said. "She just needed a chance to prove it." The party continued into the evening, with food and music and laughter. James made a speech about what wonderful parents and grandparents Eleanor and Frank were. Sarah told funny stories from their childhood. Matthew gave them a new painting he had made, a stunning depiction of the ranch house at sunset, with Frank and Eleanor sitting on the porch. "So you are always remembered like this," Matthew said. "Together, watching the sunset, like you have done every evening for as long as I can remember." Eleanor hugged her son tight, overcome with emotion at the thoughtfulness of the gift. As the grandchildren were tucked into various beds and bedrolls around the house and yard, and the adult children settled in for the night, Frank and Eleanor finally found themselves alone on the porch in their usual spots. "That was quite a day," Frank said. "It was perfect," Eleanor agreed. They sat in silence for a while, then Frank said, "I have been thinking about something." "What is that?" "About how blessed we have been, about how we need to give back." Eleanor turned to look at him. "What did you have in mind?" "I was thinking we could set up a fund to help young people who are in situations like we were. People who need a fresh start or help getting established. We have more than we need, and I would like to use it to help others the way people helped us." Eleanor felt her heart swell with love for this man who, after all these years, could still surprise her with his goodness. "I think that is a wonderful idea." They worked with the bank in Oatman to set up the Barrett Fresh Start Fund. It provided small loans and grants to people looking to establish themselves in the territory. They helped several young couples buy land, funded a scholarship for Matthew's art students, and helped numerous individuals in difficult circumstances. The work gave them purpose in their later years and allowed them to give back to the community that had embraced Eleanor so long ago. It became part of their legacy, something their children and grandchildren would continue after they were gone. On their 40th wedding anniversary, the family once again gathered at the ranch. Frank and Eleanor were both in their 70s now, moving more slowly but still active and engaged with life. The house had been expanded and renovated over the years, but they still sat on the same porch every evening in the same spot, watching the same view. During the party, Frank stood and called for everyone's attention. The room quieted, filled with children, grandchildren, and even a couple of great-grandchildren now. 40 years ago, Frank began. "I was a lonely man with a struggling ranch and not much hope for the future. I took a chance and placed an advertisement for a wife. I expected someone practical who might be willing to work hard and make a go of it. What I got was so much more." He reached for Eleanor's hand and pulled her to her feet beside him. "What I got was Eleanor Foster, a young woman in a faded calico dress who had lost everything but not her spirit. She was beautiful and brave, and she said yes to a future with me, even though she had no idea what she was agreeing to." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as Frank continued. "I told her on our wedding day that she outshined every silk gown I had seen, and I meant it. 40 years later, I still mean it. Fancy clothes and fine things do not make a person valuable. Character does. Kindness does. Love does. And Eleanor has always had all of those things in abundance." He turned to face her fully. "Thank you for saying yes. Thank you for building this life with me. Thank you for our children and grandchildren and this beautiful family we created together. You are, and always will be, the best thing that ever happened to me." The room erupted in applause and cheers. Eleanor threw her arms around Frank's neck, not caring that everyone was watching, not caring that tears were streaming down both their faces. "I love you," she whispered. "My whole life it has been you." "My whole life it has been you," Frank echoed. The party continued late into the night, but eventually everyone settled down. Frank and Eleanor made their way to their bedroom, exhausted but happy. As they got ready for bed, Eleanor caught sight of herself in the mirror. She was old now, her hair completely white, her face lined with wrinkles. But when she looked at her reflection, she did not see an old woman. She saw a life well lived. She saw strength and resilience. She saw love. "What are you thinking?" Frank asked, coming to stand behind her. "That I am grateful," Eleanor said, "for every single day, every moment. Even the hard ones, because they made the good ones sweeter." "We have had a good life," Frank agreed. "The best life," Eleanor corrected. They climbed into bed, Frank's arms coming around Eleanor the way they had every night for 40 years. Eleanor settled against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and felt completely at peace. "Frank," she said into the darkness. "Yes. If I had to do it all again, I would not change a single thing." "Neither would I," Frank said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Neither would I." As they drifted off to sleep, Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought her here. From Missouri to Arizona, from poverty to prosperity, from loneliness to love. It had all started with a leap of faith, a willingness to believe that something better was possible. She had arrived in Oatman with nothing but hope and a faded calico dress. She was leaving this life with a legacy of love, a family that would carry on their values, and memories of a partnership that had sustained her through everything. The years continued to pass peacefully. Frank and Eleanor grew even older, their bodies slowing down but their minds still sharp. They spent more time sitting on the porch, less time working, content to watch their children and grandchildren manage the ranch that they had built from nothing. Eleanor was 78 when Frank had a heart attack while out checking on some cattle. James found him and brought him back to the house, and Sarah, with her nursing experience, made him as comfortable as possible. The doctor from town came, but there was little to be done. Frank lay in their bed, Eleanor holding his hand, their children gathered around. "I am not afraid," Frank said, his voice weak but steady. "I have had more than I ever deserved in this life." "Do not talk like that," Eleanor said, even though she knew what was coming. "You are not going anywhere." "Eleanor." Frank's hand tightened around hers. "Look at me." She met his eyes, those warm, brown eyes that had looked at her with love for over 40 years. "Thank you," Frank said, "for everything. For the life we built, for our family, for loving me." "It was easy to love you," Eleanor whispered. "I will wait for you," Frank said. Wherever I am going, I will be waiting." "You better," Eleanor said, trying to smile through her tears. Frank's eyes moved to his children. "Take care of your mother and take care of each other. You are my greatest achievement." "We love you, Papa," James said, his voice breaking. "We love you," Sarah and Matthew echoed. Frank looked back at Eleanor one last time. "The girl in the calico dress," he murmured. "My beautiful girl." Then he closed his eyes and was gone. Eleanor held him for a long time, unwilling to let go, unable to accept that he was really gone. Her children gently tried to pull her away, but she shook her head. "Just a few more minutes," she said. "Please." They gave her privacy, and Eleanor lay down next to Frank, curling into his side one last time. She told him all the things she had said before but needed to say again. How much she loved him, how grateful she was, how he had given her everything. Finally, she kissed his forehead and let her children come back in. They took care of the arrangements, and the whole community turned out for Frank's funeral. Person after person stood up to talk about Frank's kindness, his fairness, his generosity. The church was overflowing. Eleanor stood at his graveside, her children supporting her on either side, and said goodbye to the love of her life. They buried him on the ranch, on a hill overlooking the land he had worked so hard to build. After the funeral, Eleanor moved through the days in a fog. She had been with Frank for more than 40 years. He had been her partner, her best friend, her love. The house felt empty without him, even though her children took turns staying with her, making sure she was not alone. One evening, a few weeks after Frank's death, Eleanor found herself standing in front of the old chest where she kept the calico dress. She opened it and lifted out the faded fabric, holding it up. The blue flowers were barely visible now, the cloth worn thin in places. She remembered the first time Frank had seen her in this dress, how nervous she had been, how he had looked at her with such kindness. She remembered their wedding day and what he had said about her outshining silk gowns. She remembered how those words had made her feel valued and beautiful in a way she never had before. Eleanor carefully folded the dress and put it back in the chest. That dress represented the beginning of her greatest adventure. Frank might be gone, but that adventure was not over. She still had her children and grandchildren. She still had the ranch and the community. She still had a life to live, and Frank would have wanted her to live it fully. The months that followed were hard. Eleanor missed Frank with an ache that never fully went away. But slowly, she found her rhythm again. She spent time with her grandchildren, teaching them to bake and garden and telling them stories about their grandfather. She continued the work with the Barrett Fresh Start Fund, helping others the way she and Frank had wanted. She lived simply, content with her family and her memories. On warm evenings, she would sit on the porch in her usual spot, and sometimes she swore she could feel Frank sitting beside her, watching the sunset with her one more time. Eleanor lived to be 86 years old. She died peacefully in her sleep, in the bed she had shared with Frank, in the house they had built together. Her children and grandchildren surrounded her in her final days, and she told them all how much she loved them, how proud she was, how grateful she was for the life she had lived. "Tell me about when you first met Papa," her youngest granddaughter asked on Eleanor's last day. Eleanor smiled, her mind traveling back across the decades. "I stepped off the stagecoach wearing a faded calico dress, scared out of my mind," she said softly. "I had nothing but a carpetbag and hope. Your grandfather looked at me, and instead of seeing my shabby clothes or my circumstances, he saw me. He saw who I really was. And he fell in love with you," the granddaughter said. "And I fell in love with him," Eleanor confirmed. "We built a life together, a beautiful life. We had hard times and good times, but we had them together, and that made all the difference." "You think you will see him again?" the granddaughter asked. "I know I will. Eleanor said with certainty. "He told me he would be waiting, and your grandfather always kept his promises." That night, Eleanor Foster Barrett closed her eyes for the last time. Her last thoughts were of Frank, of the life they had shared, of the love that had sustained her through everything. She thought of a faded calico dress and a young cowboy who had seen past fabric and circumstances to the woman underneath. She thought of sunsets watched from a porch, of children raised and loved, of a legacy that would continue long after she was gone. They buried Eleanor next to Frank on the hill overlooking the ranch. At the funeral, James told the story his father had told so many times, about the mail-order bride in the faded calico dress, and how his father had said she outshone every silk gown. He talked about how his parents had built something beautiful together, how their love had been the foundation for everything good in their family. Sarah read a letter Eleanor had written to be opened after her death. In it, Eleanor talked about her journey to Arizona, about the fear and hope that had driven her, about the incredible blessing of finding Frank. She wrote about the importance of kindness, of seeing value in all people regardless of their circumstances, of building a life based on love rather than material things. Matthew unveiled a painting he had created, a portrait of Frank and Eleanor on their wedding day. He had worked from descriptions and an old photograph, and it captured them perfectly. Frank looking at Eleanor with open admiration, Eleanor looking uncertain but hopeful, both of them young and full of dreams. "They taught us what love should be," Matthew said. "They showed us that true value comes from character, not possessions. They built something that will last for generations." After the funeral, the family gathered at the ranch house. The house was full of people and noise and life, just as Eleanor had loved it. Children ran through the rooms, people shared food and stories, and the sound of laughter filled the air. James stood on the porch with his own children and grandchildren, looking out at the land his parents had built. "We will keep this going," he said. "We will honor their memory by continuing what they started." And they did. The ranch continued to thrive, passed down through the generations. The Barrett Fresh Start Fund helped countless people over the years, giving them the same chance that Eleanor and Frank had given each other. The story of the mail-order bride in the faded calico dress became family legend, told and retold to each new generation as an example of how to see true worth in people. Years later, James's granddaughter, going through old trunks in the attic, found a carefully wrapped package. Inside was a faded calico dress with barely visible blue flowers. With it was a note in Eleanor's handwriting. "This is the dress I wore when I met my Frank," the note read. "I was poor and scared, but he looked at me and saw someone worth loving. He taught me that real beauty comes from within, that fancy clothes mean nothing compared to a kind heart. I kept this dress all these years as a reminder of where I started and how blessed I was to find love." May whoever reads this remember that every person has value, regardless of their circumstances. Look beyond the surface. You might find something more precious than gold. The dress was preserved and eventually donated to a museum in Oatman, where it was displayed with the story of Eleanor Foster Barrett, the mail-order bride who came to Arizona with nothing and built a legacy of love. Tourists would stop and look at the faded fabric and read the story, and more than one person left with tears in their eyes, moved by the simple but profound truth that Eleanor and Frank had lived. True beauty, true value, true love, these things had nothing to do with silk gowns or material wealth. They came from the heart, from seeing and being seen, from two people choosing each other and building something lasting together. In the end, that was the real legacy of Eleanor and Frank Barrett. Not the ranch, though it prospered. Not the money or the land or the material success. Their legacy was the love they shared, the family they created, and the example they set of what really matters in life. The ranch still stands, over 100 years later, still in the family, still bearing the name Lost Creek Ranch. And on a hill overlooking it all are two graves, side by side, with a shared headstone that reads, Frank Barrett and Eleanor Barrett. Beloved parents and grandparents. They saw beauty where others saw nothing, built love where others saw impossibility, and left a legacy that will last forever. And in the museum in Oatman, Arizona, visitors still stop to look at a faded calico dress and read about the cowboy who saw past the shabby fabric to the beautiful woman wearing it, and the mail-order bride who found courage enough to start over and wisdom enough to recognize love when it appeared. Their story became a reminder that the best things in life are not things at all. They are the connections we make, the love we share, and the lives we touch. Eleanor arrived in Oatman with nothing but a faded dress and a desperate hope. She left a legacy of love, family, and the profound truth that every person deserves to be seen, valued, and loved for who they truly are. And somewhere, beyond the veil of this world, a young cowboy waits on a porch watching the sunset, knowing that someday his girl in the calico dress will join him there, and they will sit together forever, just as they always did, watching the sky paint itself in brilliant colors and grateful for every single moment of the beautiful life they shared.